Welcome to Philosophy and Faith, where our goal is to help you navigate your intellectual and spiritual journey, especially in regards to topics like God, faith and doubt, meaning and purpose, and more. I'm Nathan Beasley.
And I'm Daniel Jepson. And together we discuss the big questions that humans have wrestled with for thousands of years.
We're glad you can join us.
Hello, Nathan. What's new?
Nothing much. Family time, hanging out,
Yeah.
enjoying the summer. Enjoyed a nice cool walk this morning. It was good.
I took a walk this morning also.
Yeah. For those who aren't familiar with this area, Franklin, Indiana has beautiful park system and trails and all that. So
Sure does.
I don't know. I love it. I can ride my bike pretty much from my house to here, all on trails except for the last tiny little stretch.
Yeah, I'm a little jealous of that fact.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, today we're looking at Pythagoras,
that's right.
the math guy, right? I think I learned about him in middle school.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is that. But there's a lot more.
Yeah. It was neat to see him show up on the list because I mean, when I hear his name, I think of the Pythagorean theorem.
And I might as well burst your bubble right now. There's no proof that he invented that.
Oh, man.
Yeah. But it was used before his time by the Babylonians and the Egyptians. Although either he or his disciples, the people who came a generation or two after him, probably derived the first proofs for it.
Okay.
And they got attached to his name.
Gotcha. Well, why don't you go ahead and give us a little bit of an overview?
You know, this one's important because I feel like he is one of the most influential philosophers that we're going to talk about, especially in the ancient world. He's right up there to me with Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. And that's a pretty high praise right there. That's pretty good company. And he's also interesting because the length of the movement he started, how long it lasted in history. You have a Pythagorean school or movement that lasts 1,000 years.
Wow.
Yeah, that's crazy. And then he's also interesting just because, you know, you've heard that phrase, someone's introduced the myth, the man, the legend.
The man, the myth, the legend.
Yeah, did I get it wrong?
Yeah.
Okay. The man, the myth, the legend. Yeah, well, he was all three of those. He was a man, but he was more of a myth and a legend, at least by the time history gets done with him. We know more about the mythology and legends about him than we do about the person himself.
Gotcha. I was wondering what you meant by that.
Yep. And we'll talk about some of those myths and legends. They're pretty interesting.
Cool. So just to give us a frame of reference about when in history was he alive?
All right, so last time we talked about Xenophanes, and right about the same time period, we don't have the exact dates, about 570 BC, you have this man being born. So the best guess that we have for his dates would be about 570 BC to 500 BC. And he was born, like all the other philosophers we studied so far, in Ionia, what would be the west coast of Turkey today. Back then, all that was a Greek colony area. And he was born a little bit further up the coast than the others. He was born in Samos. But somewhat early in his life, he migrated over to southern Italy. And southern Italy and Sicily were all dominated by Greek-speaking people at this time. So that was not an Italian or a Roman culture. It was a Greek culture. And he settled in a town called Croton.
Crouton?
No. I don't think we get croutons from there. It's Croton.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Crotone. And that's, again, in southern Italy. Now there in Croton, he established something of a school or a community. And another reason he's important, he's the first one to really do that, at least that we know of. And it's something, like I said, a school, a religious community. And after his death, this continued. And so Plato and Aristotle, who were writing mainly in the 3rd century BC, they interacted with students who would call themselves Pythagoreans. And then after that time period, his influence declined a little bit, but in the years after Christ and after Christianity, so for the 1st and 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, his influence comes roaring back and continues actually up until about 500 AD. Again, about 1,000 years. And this later flowering of that from, say, 200 to 500 usually goes by the name of Neoplatonism. So Neoplatonism was a combination of Plato's ideas along with other ideas derived from Pythagoras as well as some other influences.
Oh, wow. And that Neoplatonism, didn't that spark some of the Gnostics and the Docetists? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yes, a lot of the early Christian heresies were influenced by that, but also the church doctrine itself and church theology are heavily influenced by Neoplatonism.
Gotcha. Yeah, we're beginning to see how, even more so than in the past episodes, some of the philosophical roots that we've adopted and that have been infused with Christianity even began 500 years before Christ.
Exactly. And in this case, especially the idea of the soul. We get our idea of the soul from him or his school, at least, and not so much from what the Bible says. Even Christians today, I think, are more influenced by his theory of the soul as a Greek writing 500 BC rather than the Old Testament or New Testament conception of what a soul is.
So is that because Paul was influenced a lot by him, or is that kind of a bad seed that's taken root in Christian theology?
I wouldn't say Paul so much influenced by him, although he was a Hellenized Jew, so there's going to be some of that, but more the centuries right after him.
Gotcha.
So when Christian theology is first being formed.
So this will be really helpful in bringing clarity to what the Greek conception of the soul is so that we can hold that in one hand while looking at Jewish conception and then the Christian conception of the soul.
Right. I think it'll be very helpful for that. At least that's my hope. I'm more excited about this episode than probably any I've been so far.
Cool.
Yeah, there's a lot here. Maybe first, though, we should talk about the timeline of his life and thought. So again, he begins this community. It's known as this religious community, but it's also a philosophical school that's heavily invested in understanding math and music. So there's these different elements of it. It's a religious community. We'll talk about some of their strictures and rules in a minute. But it's also very much invested in studying math and viewing math as really the secret of the universe, as it were. Related to that, music. So they would view music and math as kind of like sisters to each other, or perhaps a better way of saying music is one manifestation of the mathness of the universe.
That seems like a really interesting, weird fusion, philosophy, math, and music.
Yeah, I suppose it does.
So help us understand why those are related.
Okay. Well, let me first talk about the religious idea a little bit, because then I think we can deal holistically with the other ideas and follow through that thought. The religious rituals and rules of the community are not really that important historically, but they do give some color to the Pythagorean society, and they are known for their odd, seemingly random rules.
Such as?
No eating of beans. So
no beans?
No beans. Although there are some other writers that says, no, you could eat beans. Do not stand on your own nail clippings. Do not sit on a bushel. Never touch a white rooster. Don't bury a corpse wearing wool clothes.
These feel pretty bizarre and random, like you said.
Yeah, they do to us. And I suppose some of them had a symbolic or ritualistic explanation, but if they do, those explanations are lost to us. There is one other rule, though, that won't seem odd to us, and it will also become tied in with the religious idea and the philosophical ideas. Do not eat meat.
Huh. Why that one?
Well, they were the first community to enforce vegetarianism that I know of, primarily because of their belief in the transmigration of the soul. So other living beings have the same soul that we do, just wrapped in a different outer garment, as it were. We'll come back to that idea. Maybe the first place to start in regard to their philosophy and math is this idea that reality is in all some way numbers. So all reality is numbers.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around it.
Yeah, and don't worry if that sounds confusing. Aristotle said the idea was barely comprehensible to him, and he's hardly an academic slouch, right?
I mean, it makes sense that numbers are transcendent. They're immaterial. But
yeah, that's a lot of it.
To understand exactly what he means by that, I mean, there's certainly a lot of shapes and a lot of geometry and a lot of physics. Is that what he's saying, that it underpins physics or something?
Well, let me give you what Aristotle says he thinks they mean by that, because he's a lot closer to it, obviously. He says, quote, since they, the Pythagoreans, saw that the attributes and the ratios of the musical scales were expressible in numbers, since then all other things seemed in their whole nature to be modeled after numbers, and numbers seemed to be the first things in the whole of nature, and the whole heaven to be a musical scale and number.
Oh, that's interesting.
Right.
And also like true, because we can now measure that with wavelengths and all that.
Right.
So music is very grounded in physics.
Exactly.
So that's kind of amazing that 2,500 years ago, they kind of knew that.
Yeah, it is. They are credited to being the first ones to understand how numbers guide the musical notes, as it were. I'm not saying that very well, but
This is just totally new.
okay. Well, think if you have a string that you're going to use in musical instruments like a lyre back then. And if you take two strings that are identical, but you stretch one of them out twice as much, then all of a sudden you've got exactly one octave above there, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was what they discovered, was that there was this mathematical proportion to the notes and especially the octaves. So to them, it seemed to be that, okay, here's an element of reality that is shaped by numbers that we didn't know before. So there was a little bit of a conceptual leap to thinking that all reality was like that. We just hadn't discovered it yet. Part of that came out of that was the very ancient idea of the music of the spheres being the spheres of heaven, the planets, the sun and the stars and the moon, that these all moved in this mathematical order. And that if you had the right instrument or facility, you could actually hear the music that the spheres of the heavens produced. And that's going to be something that get carried over even into the Middle Ages.
But that's interesting because things that move do oftentimes make noise. So
Yeah. Now, so that's one way in which you could say that everything is numbers. But they also went a little further in the sense that they also viewed numbers having this spiritual or psychological symbolism and significance. So different numbers represented different things.
you got any examples?
I do. So the number 2 represents man, and the number 3 represents woman. So guess what 5 represents?
Marriage.
There you go. Great.
Why? Do you know why?
No.
Okay.
I mean,
A lot of stuff has been lost. I get it.
yeah.
That's interesting.
4 is justice. I don't know why that either, but so they had this whole symbolism. And then at the same time, they also regarded numbers spatially. So 1 is a point, 2 is a line, 3 is a surface. Think of one side of a cube, and 4 is the solid. So 1, 2, 3, 4, you've got the four different dimensions. All things are in those 4 dimensions to some degree. But what's interesting here, if you add 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 together, what do you get?
10.
Right, the perfect number 10. And if you take 10 dots and you arrange them, so in the top row you've got 1, row you've got 2, spaced evenly. Row under that you've got 3, and then under that you've got 4. What do you have symbolically?
Triangle.
A triangle, yeah. Or perhaps
Pyramid.
a pyramid.
Yeah.
One of the greatest symbols of the ancient world, has a lot of spiritual significance, right?
Yeah. Points to the heavens.
Yeah, exactly. Now, let's go back to this idea of number symbolism. Number ontology refers to the status of numbers in the order of reality. So they held that numbers were not only eternal, but the very building blocks of reality, that numbers could exist, as it were, without the universe. Colin Brown summarizes it this way: mathematical knowledge was not simply a tool for research, it was a quasi-religious means of initiation into the mystery of being. So for us, we view numbers as a way to further understanding of the different disciplines, especially the sciences, right?
Mm-hmm.
But for them, it went beyond that. It was that, but it went beyond that as well. It was this means of initiation into understanding the mystery of being, or what the universe really meant.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's a lot going on there.
That's kind of hard to wrap my mind around. I'm just trying to think. It seems like every field. Now, even there's a way to think about literature mathematically and language and grammar and all that mathematically. So that's really interesting that we can see how that's all mathematical, but they're saying there's something even more religious or foundational or philosophical about the math.
Yeah.
That's just totally different from anything I've ever thought about.
Well, it all started here. And we can see why this was so attractive to people, right?
Yeah.
Because you have this thing we're all familiar with, numbers, but now this thing is key to understanding the whole meaning of the universe.
Yeah, it's accessible to anyone.
In one sense, yeah.
Yeah.
But these were also taught as secret doctrines for many generations.
Huh.
Now, one other item here, and this is probably the most consequential, is their idea of the transmigration of the soul. The transmigration of the soul. Sometimes we call that reincarnation. And remember the very first episode in this playlist about the history of philosophy, we talked about this idea buried very deep within Greek history and psychology of this shapeless stream undergirding all reality. And living things spill out of this stream into the physical reality for a while, and then they dissolve, and then they die and dissolve back into it. You remember us talking about that?
Yeah.
All right.
It's kind of been a whole theme throughout all of the podcast, but I know we've talked a lot about it in discussing Eastern thought as well. So I know that there's been a lot of overlap, and even through this history of philosophy set of podcasts, it emerged up again.
Right. And part of the reason I wanted to talk about that is because I think it's not talked about very much in the other history of philosophies I've read, for whatever reason. Partly because it's almost more of a religious idea than a philosophical idea, perhaps, or a mythological idea rather than something that the philosophers argued about.
Can you remind me the difference between the philosophy and the religion there as you're using it?
Well, in their culture, there really wasn't a distinction. But from our terminology, it would have a religious aspect to it because it was closely associated with the myths of antiquity. So before the Olympian gods that Homer, for example, would talk about, there was already this type of god worship. It was more this nature gods arising out of this shapeless stream. And there was also a religion associated with this, Orphism. But even before Orphism, which came about a little bit before Pythagoras, perhaps, it's not exactly clear. But even before that, all the way back to the Minoan situation, the Minoans on Crete, which is really the bed, as it were, the seedbed of Greek thought, you had religious rituals attached to this, trying to experience the oneness with that shapeless stream through going into the earth, having these hallucinogenic agents given to you, experiencing this ecstatic union, at least psychologically. So anyway, that's what I mean. It was attached to all these religious practices and beliefs, but you really see that coming back here. And it's going to influence Plato. I mean, Plato's conception of the soul is going to be based probably more on Pythagoras than anybody else. And Pythagoras is based on Orphism and its predecessors, which are religions.
Yeah.
The idea, I think, that we can separate religion from philosophy is not one that you can prove from the history books. They've always, from their foundation, been intertwined together.
Yeah, that's helpful. That's
Okay.
helpful. Thank you.
That's a long digression.
No, that's okay. It's helpful because you're saying they're intertwined, but just understanding the distinction there is good.
Yeah. So the earliest I can ferret out of this idea is the shapeless stream, again, going all the way back to the civilization on Crete. The shapeless stream of which living things come into and out of. But Orphism, apparently, from what we know of it, and certainly Pythagorism, took that one step beyond, so that when a person or an animal dies, its soul and body are separated, the body decaying, while the soul, which is probably this aspect of the shapeless stream, is then reborn into another animal or human body. So from what I understand anyway, originally in that shapeless stream idea, it was just when a thing died, its life force, as it were, went back into the shapeless stream. Here it has its own individual status. It's its own individual entity, this eternal soul that you would have. And so again, it's almost like you changing clothes. So you get up in the morning, you put on one set of clothes, and the next day you put on a different set of clothes. You take one off, you put the other on. The soul takes on a form of an animal or a human like you put on clothes. And then it discards that and it wears something else. Now, that idea is going to be so influential in the thought of philosophy, really the whole of Western thought and in Christian theology as well.
Because of the reincarnation of the soul, or just because he makes that distinction between body and soul?
Mainly that.
Okay.
So Christians don't believe in reincarnation, right? So we don't believe in the transmigration of the soul. But we have inherited, many of us anyway, this belief that the soul and the body are fundamentally different things.
Yeah, I die, but my soul lives on.
Right. Now, what I want to get across here, that goes back to Pythagoras, not the Old Testament.
Really?
Yes. This is called the introduction of mind-body dualism, or the soul-body dualism. The idea being that you are two things as a human being. you are your soul, or sometimes you would call it your spirit and your body, and that your soul naturally can live without your body. It has this eternal status apart from your body. And therefore, when you die, you cast off your body, but you live disembodied existence in heaven.
Wow. So you're saying that that's not scriptural?
That is not the teaching of the Old Testament, or I believe the New Testament.
That's huge.
Yeah, it is. It is. And I think if I could help people, at least Christians, if I could help Christians understand one thing throughout all the things we've been doing so far about the history of philosophy, it is this idea that this idea of the body soul dualism is an idea from Greek thought that we do not have to believe in. We can choose to believe it. We can say, oh, well, they got it right. But we have to recognize that we're doing that not because of the Bible, but because of something we're saying the Bible was silent about or wrong about, but we're adding on to that now.
So you think that this is I don't know if this is the right word, but you think it's a bad philosophy that's been imposed on Scripture, or we read Scripture through the lens of this Greek philosophy, but in some way actually taints the goodness of the truth of Scripture?
Yes, that's what I think.
Wow.
Yeah. And I've become more convinced of it the more I have thought through and read things over the years. I think we have a conception of the human soul that is more formed by Greek culture than the Christian or Hebrew scriptures, and that's a bad thing for us.
I would love for you to unpack why that's so bad, because just thinking about this, it seems like, okay, so maybe we got that wrong, but how bad can it really be to think that there's a body soul dualism?
Okay. So let me flesh this out a bit, and then we'll talk about the Hebrew thought in the Old Testament, and then we'll see how they contrast. So if the transmigration of souls is correct, then body and soul are two distinct things, not just two different ways of talking about the human person. Like you could be called a male, you could be called an American, you could be called a dad. You're all of those things. It's just a different way of talking about you.
Sure.
But that's not what this is. The body and the soul then are two distinct things. And one is not the attribute of another, like wood could be an attribute of the table. No, they are distinct. One can exist without the other. And they're not only distinct, and here's where we get to some of the implications of this, but they are two different kinds of things. So the body and soul are not just separate things, but two different kinds of things. Like you and I, we both have a nose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Those are two separate noses.
Mm-hmm.
But they're fundamentally the same kind of thing.
Yeah.
But when you think of something, say, in emotion, like bravery, and then something else like a rock, those are different kinds of things.
Right.
They're not two things of the same kind with the same characteristics. They work in different ways, different spheres, they have different attributes. And soul-body dualism says that the soul and the body are fundamentally different kinds of things. Now, if this is true, which one's more valuable? I mean, go back to the illustration we talked about before, you changing your clothes. Who's more important, or which is more valuable, you or the clothes you change into one day and out of the next?
Me.
Yeah, obviously. Because the one is here for a while, but it's going to be discarded. You do away with it. The other is eternal, and it has inherent value. So what happens here is that not only do you have two distinct things being taught, but one of those is eternal and valuable and precious, and the other really doesn't matter that much.
Yeah.
Or,
okay, I'm seeing it.
Yeah. Or it could even be a hindrance. And so one of the ideas that will come about, I don't know if Pythagoras himself taught this, but his successors certainly did, and Plato picked up on it. And Plato is the big guy, is this idea that the soul is imprisoned in the body, that the body is an unnatural home for the soul. The soul wants to be free of it. Therefore, the body is not only less valuable than the soul, but it's a detriment to the soul.
Yeah.
That carries over, as you can probably see pretty easily, into Christian theology, especially into the Middle Ages.
And that does seem to make sense. I mean, as we get older, our bodies do decay while our spirits can stay strong.
Yeah.
And a lot of people can still, in a sense, feel imprisoned by the pain and the decay of the body. So I get that in a sense, but I see what you're saying, that it can be dangerous to have such a stark distinction between the two.
Yes. Yeah. And especially when we compare it to the biblical idea of how those words are used. Obviously, if you look at the Hebrew Bible and you read it in Hebrew, you don't find the word soul. Greek word, which will come later, that we've been talking about is psyche, right? But we're talking about Hebrew, so before the Greek New Testament. And the word that will be translated as soul when the Hebrew eventually gets translated into Greek in like a century or two before Christ.
In the Septuagint.
Yes, exactly. Is the Hebrew word Nefesh.
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 Okay.
Yeah. So when the translators of the Septuagint, like I said, a century or two before Christ, when they took the Hebrew Old Testament and put it into Greek, they took the word Nephesh in Hebrew, and when they saw that, say they've got this verse or this passage, and they're going to put that in Greek, they're going to use the word psyche. That's perhaps inevitable, but it was also very unfortunate.
So the Greek language didn't have a better word for it, but it doesn't capture all of the meaning of the Hebrew word.
Right. Now, in one sense, it was probably the best choice because originally psyche had an equivalent to what Nephesh means. We'll talk about that in a second. But by the first century, that original meaning had morphed into something that had so much baggage and so many philosophical overtones that when Christians began reading that, they were Greeks who were formed in this language with this understanding of the word, and they're going to import that into it.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So these are guys who grew up in the cultural air of Platonistic philosophy.
Yeah, even though they wouldn't know it. I mean, or they may
Not
have never
necessarily,
heard the name Plato or read any of his works. But yeah, the whole Mediterranean world there was Hellenized, Greekized, as it were.
So the conception of psyche is, like you said, it's got a lot of philosophical overtones borrowed from that.
Exactly.
This is an important thing, I think, for people to realize that Bible translation is not a one-to-one
Exactly.
correlation. And so translating from Hebrew to Greek doesn't always fit neatly.
Mhm.
Same thing from Hebrew to English or Greek to English.
Exactly.
But then also something that's super interesting, we've seen it in English, go and read Shakespeare, is that language changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
And so that adds another layer of, okay, psyche, like you said, may have meant one thing when it was translated in the Septuagint, but then by the time the early disciples of Jesus are reading it and the people who have been brought in from the Gentile nations are reading it or listening to it, they're thinking about something different.
Yeah. Words change, like you said.
But we can also trace the meaning of the words as we see them in context in other places.
Sure.
So we can see, okay, this word has changed over time.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're saying, like psyche at one point may have meant something different than psyche 500 years later.
Exactly.
So we can see how it's used in context to help us understand a meaning. So that's been the beautiful thing about linguistic scholarship, as you can see.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, so you said...
Yeah, that's one of the things you learn when you take professional studies to be a pastor or sometimes a professor, depending on your field, is you learn how words change. And one of the tools, if people want to check me on this, the standard way of understanding biblical words, the best reference that's been used for almost 100 years would be the Theological Dictionary of the New Testament. It's like 13 huge volumes, very technical. And you can look up psyche, and they will then go through the history of that. But as part of that, they delve very deeply into the Old Testament words that were translated that, including Nefesh. So they've got a long section on Nefesh. They've got a huge long section on psyche, and you can that. Anyway, so the word Nefesh is going to be used over 700 times in the Hebrew Old Testament, or the Hebrew Bible. And it has the idea basically of breath. Sometimes it's even used for the throat. I think it says Joseph, when he was in prison, had a bar around his nephesh, so probably his neck. So originally it meant something like the breath or life force of a person, because when you stop breathing, you stop living, right? So it has this idea of a life force. Now, more broadly, that's its etymological use and where the word begins. But more broadly, it was just used to refer to any living being that had breath in them. So even animals in Genesis 1 are called Nephesh. Adam and Eve and the living creatures are called Nephesh.
So like breathers? The breathers?
Yeah, basically, if you wanted a full definition, there would be living beings who breathed or something like that. Or living beings, and in parentheses, we know that they're living beings because they breathe. So that's kind of the idea. And so most of the time in the Old Testament, it is used simply to refer to the whole persons. Like in the Noah's Ark, there were 8 Nephesh aboard, It's not referring to an individual inner part of you as opposed to your body. It just means the whole of who you are. So,
Like personality,
well, kind of, but all of you,
personhood.
all of you,
Yeah. Okay.
you are a Nephesh. You don't have a Nephesh. You are a Nephesh.
Me in my entirety.
Yeah.
Nathan.
Yeah. You're just a living being.
Yeah.
You're just a living being. And they're not trying to divide you up into different compartments or categories. You're just a living being. And it's like in the old usage in naval terminology, when a ship goes down, say how many souls were lost. Well, you just mean how many people died, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the primary usage of Nephesh. So it's almost always going to mean that. And when it doesn't, it usually has the emphasis of breath or breathing.
So in Joseph's case, that bar was restricting breathing or something, or I don't know.
Possibly, but originally it probably meant neck or breath because those two things are associated with each other. I mean, think of the word heart, and all that's involved in a body part, but it has this meaning. So neck or throat has this idea of the livingness.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's how the etymological drift, as it were, works.
So it's the entirety of a person
Yes.
or living being.
Yeah. And the Bible Project has a great video as well as a longer podcast about this. And basically, they just bring this out. In biblical terminology, in the Old Testament, you do not have a soul, you are a soul. You do not have a nephesh, you are a nephesh. Now, originally, that is also more or less the meaning of psyche in the Greek world. So if you look at Homer's time, and from what we can tell pre-Homer, we don't have a lot of Greek before Homer, it has that same idea of throat or breath of a person. And then it drifts into this idea of the living breath of a person. Again, this idea very similar to Nefesh. It's here with Pythagoras that word psyche begins getting all this other baggage of this inner part of you that can exist without the body, that's eternal, that is so intertwined with your mind and your ideas, and it doesn't really need the body. Even the body could be an imprisonment for this thing. That is going to start here, but from that, then, it's going to drift into the mainstream of Greek thought, especially by the time Plato gets it. Remember, Plato's the big guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Plato is the one who really sets the standard and the definitions and the meanings. And so for him, he's going to take mainly this idea, and he's going to develop this idea of the soul as something apart from the body, that the body, in many ways, is inimical to. It's not suited to this. Now, I'm talking too much. Do you have a question there? Or I have one more point to bring out about this.
So it's just Pythagoras has a new idea, but he's co-opting old language, and language creates culture.
Yeah.
So he's giving an old word a new definition, and we see this happen all the time in English too.
Sure.
Giving an old word a new definition, and that has opened up, in a sense, people's eyes to think about it in a new way.
Yeah.
And that is what it is, but that can be difficult, especially when what he's trying to describe isn't necessarily the right thing. I don't know. This is a hard thing to kind of talk about because I'm trying to wrap my mind around it as well.
Sure. Yeah. So just backing up then, this is around 500 BC. Plato is going to be a century or two later than that, and all this thought then is going to be changing about what this word or this concept of the soul is. Testament's going to be translated from Hebrew into Greek using that word psyche for nephesh after all that. So centuries after this has begun. And it's going to be read and understood by people in the Greek world in the last part of the first century. So Christianity is going to move out of its Jewish roots in Palestine or Israel into the broader Hellenized world, last half of the first century, beginning of the second century and into the third century, into cultures and places where people already think they know what the soul is. So when they read that word psyche, soul, in the Greek New Testament, they are going to define it by what they think that word means. not necessarily traced back how its Hebrew equivalent is used in the Old Testament.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah. This idea then of this body-soul dualism is going to go all through Greek culture and into Christianity because of that. Christian theology is a fusion of Greek thought and Hebrew revelation and New Testament revelation. It's a fusion of those two things. It is not pure scripture. And I think we have to keep that in mind. I didn't realize this. 20, 30 years ago, I would have thought that that was a huge overstatement. I don't think it is now. It might be an overstatement to some degree, but it's not a big one. So you have within all this time period then this idea that this soul is eternal. The soul is valuable. The soul is precious. It elevated. It's part of this eternal world of forms according to Plato. And the body is part of this world of form down here. And it's going to be disposed of. It's like changing your clothes. And actually, the passions of the body work against the formation of the soul. They warp it. When you have that, then you're going to end up one of two ways in how people live. One way is that you're going to have this severe asceticism. So you're going to deny bodily pleasure so that you can purify your soul.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to see that carried out, especially in regards to food and drink and sex, because those are the most bodily pleasures that we have usually.
Mm-hmm.
And even into the Middle Ages, you would have these things viewed as necessary evils at best. I remember reading an account of a woman who was questioned by the Inquisition because of some things going on in their village and everything. And she related the questions that they were asking. And they asked a lot of questions. They asked about her sex life. And she said, well, yeah, we have children. My husband and I have had sex. And they said, did you ever have sex for the purposes of not having children? And then they asked, did you ever enjoy sex? And the idea being, you better answer no. Yeah. That was just one sliver, one way that whole attitude towards human sexuality was warped by this. So one way that you deal with this then is by trying to avoid all the bodily pleasures that you can. You have to have some, you have to eat, you have to drink. You don't have to have sex, but if you want your religion to keep on growing, you kind of do. But you want to minimize it, place restrictions on it. The other way...
I've got a quick story if I
may. Go ahead.
I heard the story of an old Benedictine monks who they used to wear shirts made of camel hair in order to denigrate the body, to try to, I guess part of that was to get rid of their body pleasures and that sort of thing for the purpose of letting the soul be free from that.
Yeah.
And I also heard a story of a monk who would throw himself in thorn bushes for the same purpose.
Okay.
The body needs to be denied in order to set the soul free, so to speak. So, yeah, certainly in my reading of church history, I've seen that a lot.
Yeah. That reminds me, I was reading in Colossians, where Paul, the author of Colossians, is arguing against the philosophy that was already taking root in the first century when he's writing this. And here's what he writes in Colossians 2:16. Therefore, do not let anyone judge you by what you eat or drink, or with regard to a religious festival, a new moon celebration, or a Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. Do not let anyone who delights in false humility and the worship of angels disqualify you. Since you died with Christ to the elemental spiritual forces of this world, why, as though you still belong to the world, do you submit to its rules? Quote, do not handle, quote, do not taste, quote, do not touch. These rules, which have to do with things that are all destined to perish with use, are based on merely human commands and teachings. Such regulations indeed have an appearance of wisdom with their self-imposed worship, their false humility, and their harsh treatment of the body, but they lack any value in restraining sensual indulgence. So already mixed up somehow with the Colossian heresy was this harsh treatment of the body.
Yeah.
All these rules.
Don't eat, don't touch, don't handle.
Right. Now, I said that was one road you go down when you have this body-soul dualism, right? The other, which happens to be far, far popular, is to say, okay, well, then if the spirit's the only thing that matters and the body doesn't matter, I can do whatever I want with my body, and it doesn't matter because my soul is all that's important. So I can go out and I can eat, drink, and be merry. I can go out and have sexual immorality. I can go out and do all these things. I can get drunk or whatever. And those are just bodily sins, so they don't really count.
Hmm.
So you have a libertine spirit, and Paul talked about that too in some of his epistles. So why in Paul's world, already in the first century, he was warning some people against these self-imposed rules and other people against saying, well, the body for food and food for the body. And so it doesn't matter what I do with my body, so he's warning against them at the same time. And that's because of this body soul dualism and adhering to that instead of this Hebrew idea that the body is a good gift of God, an essential part of who we are, and it is as much a gift of God and valuable in God's sight as any other part of us.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I never noticed those two sides stemming from this philosophical stream of the body-soul dualism.
Yeah. Yeah, that's how I read it anyway.
So that's huge. So what you're saying is that I am, in a sense, my body. I am, in a sense, my spirit. Those two things aren't separate.
They're not separate. Now, obviously, Christian teaching does have the idea that this particular body that we're in isn't our final form, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
or that when it dies that we are extinct as an individual. But it has the idea rather that this forms a basis somehow in God's power for a new type of embodied existence. So it's not clear to me that you can get any teaching from the New Testament or the Old that the soul can exist apart from the body.
Hmm.
I've seen some people make that argument. It's not clear to me that they're persuasive about that. It seems to me the drift of most of the teaching about the human personality is that we are designed to live as bodily beings.
Hmm.
And that will always be the case. That's the way God designed it as humans. He's not giving up on that. It's a beautiful expression of his wisdom to have bodied humans representing him, the invisible disembodied spirit. Again, that's how I understand it.
Is it 1 Corinthians 15 or 1 Corinthians 16 where he goes into detail about the resurrected bodies and what that will look like?
15.
15. And so there is continuity. I mean, the illustration he gives is a seed that is our current bodies, goes in the ground and dies, but it resurrected, it becomes a tree or a plant or something. So there's continuity in form, but there still is form.
Mm-hmm.
It's not, okay, the seed goes and then something that's just spiritual comes.
Exactly.
No, it's new heaven and new earth. We're still embodied beings.
Mm-hmm.
Now, just for clarification, maybe we don't want to get into this now, but are you using soul and spirit synonymously? We'll try to make the distinction that we're tripartite, body, soul, and spirit. I've never really understood that. I haven't really explored it either, but
Yeah. I tend to use them synonymously. I do that unconsciously. However, I'm not trying to use them synonymously. Okay. It's just that they're so associated with the inner aspect of man, or speaking of a human's inner side, the mind, thought, heart. As far as I can tell, the scriptures do not use consistent terminology when speaking of mind, body, spirit as three separate parts. Sometimes soul and spirit seem to be used synonymously.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah. But of course, soul is suke. Spirit would be pneuma, which has the idea of breath again. Very much related to the original idea of suke or nefesh. Mm-hmm. So I don't think the Bible intends to use those as separate parts of humans. It just uses different words for kind of the same concepts, is how I would understand it.
Gotcha. So Pythagoras.
Yeah, that's a lot there, huh?
So
I thought this was going to be a short episode. I really did.
It's just so fascinating that we're still working through some of the things that Pythagoras was working through, even outside of geometry class.
Right. Probably the least important thing about him from our point of view, anyway.
Wow.
Yeah.
I feel like this will be a conversation that we'll continue to work through as we get into Plato and others.
Yeah, sure will.
Because this seems huge, and I'm really interested in continuing to think through the way that the body-soul dualism has affected Christianity and also the implications of all that.
Right.
So.
Yeah, and again, I think we're seeing here the truth of that aphorism that we started this whole playlist or this series about the history of philosophy about. We study history not to remember the past, but to understand the present. And that's how this has helped me, and I hope it helps other people that way.
Yeah. Cool. So what we do in the body really does matter.
It does.
And we shouldn't just say, well, it doesn't matter because it's going to go to hell in a handbasket, or not that. But it doesn't matter because it's just going to be done away with, and then my soul will be resurrected. But we should really take seriously what Paul says to discipline our bodies, because what we do in the body affects our entire personhood.
Right. For good and for bad, not just for bad.
Yeah. That makes me think through just all the discussion about spiritual practices and habits and how important those can be.
Right.
And general habits, because we are one whole being, not just body and soul. So
Right.
This is really neat, and already you can see a lot of the implications shining through.
Cool. Well, I hope it's helpful to a lot of people.
Cool. Well, thank you so much.
My pleasure. See you next time.
Thanks so much for listening. If you like what you hear, click follow or subscribe depending on your platform. Check the notification bell so you're up to date with new episodes, and leave us a review. Until next time.